Today I want to talk about something that most people think is impossible, but I genuinely believe is not only possible, it is actively being engineered right now. I'm talking about oil hitting $200 a barrel. Now before you laugh and before you call me crazy, just hear me out. What I want to show you today isn't just what happens when oil hits $200, but more importantly, why it happens, who actually benefits, and how this rewires the entire world country by country. So sit back and relax. Treat this as speculation, treat it as a thought experiment. I'm not an economist and I don't have a PhD. I'm just a curious person connecting dots that usually get ignored. Keep that in mind. Oil is not just fuel. Oil is civilization itself. Look around you right now. Your plastic phone case, the synthetic rubber in your shoes, the medicine in your cabinet, the fertilizer that literally grew the food you ate for breakfast this morning. All of it comes from oil. So when people assume a $200 barrel just means expensive petrol, they are missing the forest for the trees. What actually happens is that everything becomes expensive. Every single thing you touch, eat, or buy. Keep that reality in the back of your mind as we dive deeper. Oil isn't merely a commodity to be traded. It is the underlying operating system of the modern world. So how exactly does oil get priced? This is where the curtain gets pulled back. If you study a textbook, they will feed you the standard supply and demand narrative. A lot of oil means the price drops. A scarcity of oil means the price spikes. It sounds like basic economics 101.
But remember our previous discussions on interest rates.
We established that rates aren't really about consumer behavior. They are about coordinating global liquidity. Well, the price of oil works on a similar wavelength. It is not strictly about supply and demand. It is a mechanism for coordinating global power. Think about the players setting the price. On one side, you have OPEC, essentially Saudi Arabia and its strategic partners controlling the physical flow. On the other side, you have Wall Street and the futures market controlling the paper flow. Here is the part that should keep you awake at night. The paper oil market, which is made up of derivatives, bets, and futures contracts, is roughly 10 times larger than the physical oil market. For every 1 barrel of real, thick, black oil pumped out of the ground, 10 barrels of paper oil are traded on screens. So ask yourself, who really dictates the price? Is it the engineers pumping oil in the desert, or the financial elites making leverage bets in Manhattan?
I think you know the answer.
You don't just wake up one random Tuesday to find oil at $200. There has to be a catalyst, an event that breaks the current paradigm. And right now, there are 3 primary candidates. The first, and frankly the most obvious, is a major geopolitical conflict in the Middle East. Specifically, an event that chokes off the Strait of Hormuz. That strait is a narrow, fragile stretch of water between Iran and Oman, and roughly 20% of the world's daily oil supply passes through it. If that strait closes, and make no mistake, Iran has the military capability to shut it down if pushed to the brink, 1/5 of the global oil supply evaporates overnight. In that scenario, the price doesn't just creep up, it violently and immediately spikes. The second trigger is the collapse of the US dollar's dominance. We've discussed the petrodollar system before. Forged in 1974 between the United States and Saudi Arabia, the deal was brutally simple but wildly effective. Saudi Arabia prices and sells its oil exclusively in US dollars. And in exchange, America provides military protection for the Saudi royal family. You protect my regime, I make your currency the indispensable currency of global energy. Because every nation needs energy, every nation is forced to acquire US dollars. This structural demand is what allows America to print trillions without immediate hyperinflation. The world simply absorbs it. But what happens if that system fractures? What if Saudi Arabia decides to sell oil in Chinese yuan, Indian rupees, or a newly minted BRICS currency? The artificial demand for the dollar vanishes, the currency weakens, and the nominal price of oil in dollar terms skyrockets. You don't even need a physical war to hit $200 oil. You just need the geopolitical financial architecture to crack.
Then there is the third trigger, the one whispered about but rarely spoken aloud. What if the spike is entirely deliberate? What if certain powerful entities actively want oil at $200? I know it sounds conspiratorial, but follow the logic and follow the money. Who actually benefits from a massive price shock? As we go through this country by country, you will notice a glaring pattern. The populations that suffer are the ones that rely on oil to survive. The entities that benefit are the ones that control the oil. And more importantly, the financial players who quietly position themselves before the shock ever hit the news. Think of John Paulson making $20 billion betting against the housing market in 2008. The exact same asymmetry exists in energy. If you know for a fact that oil is heading to $200 and you buy futures today at $80, you have just engineered generational wealth. Keep that framing in mind as we map out the global fallout.
Let's start by looking at America. The United States is a fascinating paradox because it is simultaneously the world's most voracious consumer of oil and, thanks to the shale revolution, one of its largest producers. Fracking technology allowed America to pump oil out of bedrock, achieving a level of energy independence that changed global geopolitics. On the surface, you might assume $200 oil is a massive win for the US. American energy giants like Exxon and Chevron would literally be printing money. But peel back one layer. The American economy is built on a foundation of 70% consumer spending. If oil hits $200, gasoline easily surges to $8 or $9 a gallon. Suddenly, the average American family is bleeding an extra $1,000 a month just to commute and heat their homes. Discretionary spending evaporates. Restaurants board up their windows. Retail spending plummets.
The logistics networks that power Amazon deliveries become prohibitively expensive.
Because every manufacturing plant runs on energy, the cost of goods explodes, triggering runaway inflation. The Federal Reserve is then trapped in a nightmare scenario. Crush inflation and intentionally trigger a brutal recession, or do they let inflation run hot and vaporize the purchasing power of the working class? Either way, the average citizen is decimated. Meanwhile, the oil executives and the hedge funds positioned for the spike walk away richer than ever. America becomes a tale of two extremes. The protected few thrive, while the majority drowns. Move across the Atlantic to Europe, and the narrative turns from difficult to downright terrifying. Unlike America, Europe has virtually no domestic oil reserves, save for a shrinking supply in the North Sea. The continent is entirely at the mercy of imports. Think back to 2022, when the war in Ukraine broke out and cheap Russian energy was cut off. Germany, the industrial beating heart of Europe, went into cardiac arrest. Manufacturing costs spiked, and legacy factories either shut their doors forever or relocated to the US and Asia just to survive. That happened when oil peaked around $120. Now imagine layering a $200 price tag over that fragile recovery. German heavy industry, already on life support, would flatline. The iconic European auto industry, already hemorrhaging market share to cheap Chinese electric vehicles, faces total collapse. Then look at nations like France, Italy, and Spain, which are already suffocating under mountains of sovereign debt. When energy prices double, their governments are forced to heavily subsidize utility bills to prevent mass riots. But they don't have the capital to do it. You end up with a sovereign debt crisis colliding with an energy crisis, triggering a profound social crisis.
Historically, when populations are cold, hungry, and terrified about the future, they turn to political extremes. Europe at $200 oil isn't just an economic crisis, it is a catalyst for radical political fragmentation. Then there is China. China's exposure is massive because it is the largest importer of oil on the planet, feeding the largest manufacturing base in human history. At $200 a barrel, the cost of producing goods in Chinese factories goes through the roof, which means Chinese exports instantly become wildly expensive. This threatens to break the entire economic model China has relied on for 3 decades. Cheap labor combined with cheap energy to supply the world with cheap goods. However, China is a totally different beast than Europe, because Beijing has been preparing for this exact scenario for years. They have been aggressively stockpiling strategic petroleum reserves. They have spent a decade locking in long-term structural energy partnerships with Russia, Iran, Venezuela, and resource-rich African nations. Crucially, they are increasingly settling these trades in yuan rather than dollars, insulating themselves from the petrodollar trap. Yes, China will still feel the pain of a $200 price tag. No one is immune, but they are heavily armored against the worst of it. Furthermore, Beijing would use this brutal price shock to radically accelerate its transition away from fossil fuels. They are already dominating the global rollout of solar panels, electric vehicles, and nuclear reactors. In the long run, surviving a $200 oil shock might actually cement China's position as the dominant superpower of the 21st century. India's situation is the one that is the most tragic. Somber, India is currently at a fragile, critical inflection point. They are attempting to replicate the miraculous economic boom China experienced in the 90s and 2000s, building massive infrastructure, scaling up manufacturing, and lifting hundreds of millions of citizens out of desperate poverty. To execute a miracle of that scale, you need an endless supply of cheap energy. The problem: India imports roughly 85% of its oil. At $200 a barrel, India's national import bill becomes mathematically devastating. The rupee would inevitably collapse under the sheer weight of the dollars required to secure that energy. This triggers a vicious cycle of inflation that directly attacks the most vulnerable. In India, the price of energy and the price of food are deeply intertwined. Diesel runs the trucks that deliver produce, and oil is the bedrock of the agricultural fertilizer they rely on. A spike to $200 oil means food prices could easily surge by 40 or 50%. For a family surviving on a few $100s a month, that is not an inconvenience, it is a literal fight for survival. India has played a brilliant tactical game recently by buying heavily discounted Russian crude in defiance of Western sanctions, and frankly, you can't blame them. But when the baseline price hits $200, a minor discount is like bringing a bucket of water to a raging forest fire. The economic and social fabric of the country would be pushed to the absolute breaking point. Now consider Russia. In this scenario, Russia is the undisputed immediate victor. As one of the top hydrocarbon producers globally, every single dollar the price of oil ticks up is pure, unadulterated profit for Moscow. At $200 a barrel, Russia generates a staggering tsunami of revenue, completely neutralizing the impact of Western financial sanctions. We've already seen that when the West tried to lock them out, the oil didn't stop flowing. It simply found new buyers in China, India, Turkey, and the global South. Concerned, at $200, Putin's war chest becomes virtually bottomless. He can fund military operations indefinitely and buy absolute domestic compliance by insulating his population from the economic pain the rest of the world is feeling. From a geopolitical standpoint, a regime flush with that much cash becomes emboldened, aggressive, and highly confident. They don't have to compromise. They don't have to negotiate from a position of weakness. A $200 barrel of oil is the greatest gift Vladimir Putin could ever ask for. Which leads you back to that uncomfortable question. If this scenario emerges, who allowed the conditions for it to happen, knowing full well who the biggest beneficiary would be? It's something to think about. What about Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states? On a spreadsheet, a price spike looks like a golden era for them. Saudi Arabia would generate a level of wealth that is almost difficult to comprehend. The Saudi Sovereign Wealth Fund, already approaching $1 trillion, would swell to astronomical proportions. They could accelerate futuristic mega projects like NEOM, host endless global sporting events, buy up every premium asset in Europe, and inject themselves into every facet of Western culture and finance. But there is a lethal long-term poison hidden inside that short-term windfall. If oil hits $200 and stays there, it provides the entire world with a desperate existential incentive to abandon fossil fuels immediately. Energy independence shifts from a polite environmental goal to an urgent matter of national security. The transition to renewables, nuclear, and alternative tech would be fast-tracked like a wartime mobilization. That represents an existential threat to the Gulf. Saudi Arabia has built an entire civilization on top of a single commodity. If a massive price shock accidentally speeds up the permanent destruction of oil demand, they win the decade but completely lose the century.
Finally, we have to talk about the nations that never make the headlines. Countries like Pakistan, Egypt, Ethiopia, and Bangladesh. These nations are already walking a fiscal tightrope. Pakistan is trapped in a cycle of IMF bailouts. Egypt is draining its treasury just to subsidize basic bread and fuel for its massive population. For these countries, a jump to $200 oil transcends an economic downturn. It triggers a full-blown humanitarian collapse. They don't have the foreign exchange reserves to weather the storm, nor the diplomatic leverage to secure backdoor discounts. Their currencies will disintegrate. Their governments will quite literally be unable to afford the energy required to import or grow food. And as history relentlessly proves, when people cannot afford to feed their children, societies burn. Think back to the Arab Spring of 2011.
That entire geopolitical earthquake wasn't just born out of a desire for democracy. It was fundamentally ignited by a spike in global food and energy prices. A Tunisian street vendor didn't set himself on fire because of an abstract political theory. He did it because the cost of living destroyed his ability to survive. At $200 oil, the conditions are perfectly set for an Arab Spring on a global synchronized scale. We are talking about the simultaneous destabilization of dozens of governments.
Which brings me to the core lesson I want you to walk away with today. I mentioned at the beginning that this shock might be engineered, and I want you to carefully consider who truly profits from global panic. Wealth and power are not forged in times of stability. They are consolidated in times of chaos. When nations are collapsing, someone with deep pockets is stepping in to negotiate sovereign resource deals for pennies on the dollar. When the middle class is panicking, liquidating their portfolios, and worrying about how to afford groceries, there is a very calm, incredibly wealthy entity on the other side of that trade, buying up distressed assets at rock-bottom prices. We saw this exact mechanism play out during the Great Depression in 1929, and we watched it happen again during the financial crisis in 2008. The bubble expands, the working class buys in at the peak, the floor falls out, the public loses everything, and a highly coordinated inner circle ends up owning a larger percentage of the planet than they did yesterday. So the real question isn't just what happens to the global economy when oil hits $200. The terrifying question is this: who decided it was finally time to pull the trigger? And what exactly are they planning to buy with the ashes of the chaos that follows? We will dive into the mechanics of who actually runs that game in our next class. For now, look at your own country. Are you a producer or a consumer? Are you positioned as a winner or a casualty? And most importantly, recognize that inside every losing nation, there is a small elite winning massively. And inside every winning nation, the average citizen will eventually be made to pay the price. That is how the game is played.